in climate geopolitical factions. Secondly, we need a glass half full approach to the Accord and climate negotiations, not just because it's the only one we've got, but also because there have been significant developments before and after Copenhagen. Filling the rest of that glass, finally, requires fast start finance commitments made in Copenhagen to be honoured. It requires a new approach to climate multilateralism, its forums and its factions, and even more important than ever, credible domestic policies. At the core of the challenge of the new climate realpolitik, the new climate multilateralism, are two questions. Is an all-embracing, legally binding treaty possible or indeed required to drive the much stronger action and investment we need? And secondly, will Australia and others be creative and committed enough amongst souring domestic politics to play a constructive role? Or will Australia drift back to old factions, a narrow focus, and even worse, back to being a millstone on climate negotiations? Only time will tell what the answers to some of those questions are, but we can start to make the journey forward from Copenhagen towards a more ambitious cooperation between nations. But let me start with some reflections on the meeting itself. I arrived some 2 days into the 2 week-long talks. I arrived after the release of ads showing a young girl threatened sequentially by a series of climate impacts. After the city had been plastered with ads from Coca-Cola to Siemens playing off the Copenhagen theme. After a huge sphere was erected in the city centre, swathed in high-tech Copenhagen messages. We'd moved from Copenhagen to Hypenhagen. And given the build-up, I had uneasy feelings that this was not going to end very well. All this hype was a mismatch with the reality of the preceding month's negotiations, which made it very clear, even by early 2009, that no complete ratifiable treaty would be agreed in Copenhagen. It's important, if not now academic, though, to understand that the 2007 meeting in Bali, which had outlined the roadmaps to Copenhagen, did not agree to deliver a new legally binding agreement by then. Instead, the task was to achieve an agreed outcome, with no further clarification of what that outcome should be. It is important also to realise that Bali wasn't a triumph of diplomacy. It was a smash-em-up derby that just fell across the line, with trust reserves at very low levels indeed between the countries. So a new treaty may have been viewed as an optimal outcome from Copenhagen, but it was never guaranteed or even promised. In October last year, by which time it was well and truly clear that there would be no ratifiable treaty, the Climate Institute released a briefing paper concluding that the success of any agreed outcome should be judged on the achievement in 5 key areas. Firstly, climate security. Did it aim to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, and importantly, to peak global pollution before 2020? Secondly, to legal form. Did it build on the Kyoto Protocol with commitment to finalise a new agreement before the conclusion of the Kyoto period in 2012? Thirdly, on finance, committing to urgent fast start, or pre-2012, mostly public investment in developing countries' mitigation and adaptation, with a focus on innovative and additional private market sources kicking in from then. Fourthly, on accountability and transparency, providing independent and internationally verification of mitigation, finance and carbon markets. And finally, it needed to be politically durable. It needed to broaden participation in legally binding but fair commitments with advancing developing countries, whilst also recognising that developed countries need to lead and to support in particular adaptation in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. Before Copenhagen, indeed, actually optimism built up as the US, followed by China and then India, signalled that they were prepared to commit internationally to emissions targets. And even 2 days from the conclusion of the meeting, there were slender hopes alive amongst us at the meeting that much of these foundational elements could be achieved. As is the way in these and just about every other negotiation, the key cards, of course, were only finally put on the table as the deadline approached. Firstly, Australia, followed by other Kyoto developed countries, started to get off the fence about whether they would insist on a post-2012 single-track binding agreement, but they actually committed to a 2-track process for a few years where the Kyoto Protocol coexists with another track of commitments for advancing developing countries and the US, which of course never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. This second track does need to be strong enough though. If it is too weak, it will kill Kyoto, as others claim to have some in the Kyoto Club, as much as any other move by the Kyoto members. By encouraging members of, if it's too weak a second track, members of Kyoto will of course jump ship towards that weaker track with the lesser obligations, and so it is important that that had equal balance in some way. Secondly, China and later Brazil indicated that financing being called for from developed countries to developing countries didn't need to be directed at themselves, that they should be directed at other developing countries. This was vital for a US administration being circled by climate hawks sharpening their talons at the prospect of an agreement that would see the US dollars going to finance the growth of competitors, particularly in China. Our very own hawks, Senators Joyce and Boswell, trotted out the same line with great predictability before and even after this important concession. Thirdly, and perhaps liberated by that commitment, and despite previously signalling that this was a red line for them in the talks, Hillary Clinton arrived and, in the context of a global agreement, stated that the US could support an aim of generating $100 billion a year by 2020 from the public and private sector financing. These developments, as well as solid progress in negotiations on deforestation and technology transfer, combined with rumours of an agreement between the US and China on independent verification, to quicken the pulses of those of us stalking the halls of Copenhagen. But not those of the closest negotiators. They remained fairly grim-faced around the organic apple carts of the Copenhagen Hall. For in reality, stronger geopolitical forces were at play. Now, much attention has been focused on the obstructionism of China and India as they appeared to relish the opportunity of standing eyeball to eyeball with the US. Signs of this new assertiveness had emerged throughout the meetings of negotiators throughout the year and in forums like the G20. Negotiators from developed countries struggled to pick the internal Chinese power plays and their implications for the Copenhagen talks. Positive comments from the Chinese Premier at the June G8 meeting never seemed to manifest themselves in actions at the G20 finance ministers' meetings or leaders' meetings closer to Copenhagen. Meanwhile, sabre-rattling comments from lead Chinese negotiators warning off those seeking international verification of Chinese domestic actions sparked an exuberant following in the Chinese blogosphere and domestic constituencies. Despite the fact that precedents already existed for external verification in WTO and nuclear agreements, this is very clearly a sensitive area for China. It's important to note that politicians always speak to their domestic audience, and it's no different in China.